Hello and welcome to this DW News live stream on the Iran war, now well into its third week. I'm Girish Banerjee.
And I'm Gerhard Elfers.
Today we're looking at the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, where shipping has been disrupted by Iranian attacks. And now Donald Trump wants the help of other countries to keep the strait safe.
So what do you think about all that? Drop your comments and especially your questions you want to ask our guests. Drop them in the chat, both on YouTube and TikTok. We're monitoring this. And I'll try and bring those questions into the discussion.
And we'll be having that discussion with our correspondents in Taipei and Brussels. But first, the Truth Social post by Donald Trump, where he asked Asian countries and some European allies for help. That is that post. Now, he was asking China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK and others to send ships to the Hormuz Strait so that it is no longer a threat, no longer threatened by a nation that has been totally decapitated. Now, one wonders, of course, if the nation has been totally decapitated, why would there be a threat at all? But maybe there is something here that we don't know. But maybe somebody who does have the answers to some questions is DW East Asia correspondent Rick Glauert, who's joining us from Taipei. Rick, Trump wants China, South Korea, Japan to send ships to keep the Strait of Hormuz safe. And Japan's Prime Minister has been responding to that demand. I'd like to play a soundbite from her, and then I'll come to you for more.
As I mentioned earlier, if I were to approve this and the Minister of Defense were to issue the order, the situation is such that we cannot dispatch troops if the opposing party is assumed to be a state or an organization equivalent to a state. It means it's extremely difficult legally.
Rick Glauert is with us from Taipei. Rick, why is it extremely difficult legally?
Well, Takaichi is talking about, obviously, Japan's pacifist constitution. That's the constitution it has after the Second World War, which basically really limits what its military can do. So the sort of things that we'll see Japan's military, which is called its self-defense force, it's not really called the Navy, the kind of missions it can conduct is sort of anti-piracy, policing, this sort of thing. It can't, under the constitution, it can't join an ongoing conflict. Obviously, one of the things that that might be of interest for Trump, for the US, is that Japan does have a fleet of really sophisticated minesweeping vessels, but they can't just enter an active conflict. In the past, though, they have joined, I think it was one of the earlier Gulf Wars, but they would join after the conflict is finished. So perhaps Japan could offer to, use the minesweepers after the conflict is finished. Those mines would then not be, active. They would be considered abandoned, not belonging to a nation state or an actor, which is what Takaichi was referring to there.
It's quite a difficult position, isn't it, for Takaichi? Firstly, Japan is a treaty ally of the United States. You have a U.S. naval presence, a very large U.S. naval and armed forces presence across Japan, although we can discuss how much of that is moving perhaps to this other theater of war. So Japan is a treaty ally, and Sanae Takaichi is, I think, going to be in the United States Thursday, later this week, for a one-on-one with Donald Trump. It puts her in a very difficult position, doesn't it?
Yes, it's a really tricky situation for Takaichi, between a bit of rock and a hard place. She obviously wants to shore up, keep the US on side, an incredibly important relationship for Japan. They've got off to a good start. They get on well. Trump was really good friends with Shinzo Abe, who is seen as kind of was a mentor to Takaichi. And so I think, Takaichi's been able to buy a bit of time. She said there's no formal request, that they have to look into the legality, whether it's conforms to their constitution, that sort of thing. But really, she's going to be thinking, how can she avoid being put on the spot, particularly in front of the cameras in the White House? How she's going to need to get a response ready for how Japan could come, or how it might be able to work together with the US on this tricky situation on the Straits of Hormuz. Yeah.
Talk about timing for a state visit, which must be said was planned well before the Iran war got underway. But just since we are talking about this visit from Takaichi, do we know what generally is on her agenda? What does she want from Donald Trump? We know what Donald Trump wants from her, but what does she want from Donald Trump? Just a quick word on that.
I think it's all really about stability, about showing that that relationship works. I think a lot of leaders in this region and around the world have kind of lowered their expectations about what they can build together with these a bit high-stake meetings. It's really quite often a bit about damage control, really. Japan had been wanting to talk more about closer security cooperation, energy security, how their different defense systems. Takaichi is very keen on bolstering Japan's defense. She's a nationalist, but I should imagine that she'll be just thinking how to weather the issue this week, which is the Iran war.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm just looking at some of the comments on YouTube. There is a user at LG2971, I hope I'm getting this right, who's making the comment that, well, please, Japan, stand up to the bully. And somebody else making the point, this is at The Truth Matters, the last. I don't know how verifiable this comment is, but saying, even in the Korean War, Japan sent minesweeper ship. Takaichi is disgruntled with Trump. I'm not sure about whether Japan sent that minesweeper ship or not. But let's just move on. Can you talk to us about the impact that the war in Iran is having on Japan?
Yes, so for Japan, they're a big importer of oil, crude oil. I think about as much as 90% of their crude oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. So they're taking a big hit, a big manufacturing economy that relies on a lot of energy. Japan, I think, just in the last couple of days has been releasing some of that emergency stockpile of oil that it has built up. I think it has 254 days worth, and it's released about 45 days or something at the moment, showing the lengths that it's having to go to keep the markets stable, to keep the economy running, to keep people being able to have their homes lit, everything like that. So it's really putting a big strain on Japan and other big economies here in Asia.
We're going to come back to the Strait of Hormuz in a moment. We have a question here from coming via TikTok from Poplin123 asking whether Japan was afraid of a China attack. I'm not quite sure who China should attack, but is our relations with China also part of the consideration here?
Well, Japan's had a really interesting, especially under Takaichi, they've had a very interesting relationship with China over the last few months. Takaichi, in her first few weeks in office, made that comment that any move from China on Taiwan could be considered as an existential threat to Japan. So back to that idea of Japan's constitution, if it was considered an existential threat to Japan, that means Japan's military could get involved. This was seen as a big deal for China. China, of course, claims Taiwan is part of its sovereign territory and part of its internal affairs, has its own issues dating back to the Second World War with Japan. So relations between China and Japan have deteriorated rapidly. There's been increased Chinese patrols in disputed islands between China and Japan. There's been economic action by China. But one thing about Takaichi, which we should mention, is that she became leader and then held an election and was once again voted into office. On a real nationalist stance. She stood up to China. She is determined to spend more on defense for Japan, and so she is worried about the China threat, and she has been quite clear about the threat that it poses to Japan and that Japan needs to face it. Of course, part of that is being part of the kind of US security umbrella in a way, and so that's how it all links together.
I do want to talk about China in greater detail, but then let's just before that focus a bit more on the aspect of energy supplies that come through the Strait of Hormuz. And Gerhard, I know that you've been looking at the Strait of Hormuz. We fortunately have live tracker maps that we can look at and maybe look at the impact that this is actually having in the Asian region.
Exactly. Let's bring this up here. I think yes, there it is, and there you can see quite clearly this bend, the Strait of Hormuz. Which we earlier called the Bend of Hormuz.
We should probably just call it the Bend of Hormuz. I mean, it's not straight, but it is narrow.
It is narrow, and you can see that in the very bend of it, there's not much traffic there. But if you go further down here and look into it, you see red dots and green dots, but mainly red dots. And the red dots indicate that those are all tankers. If we bring one up here, that is a crude oil tanker, and also all the others. The same applies to the other side of it. If you look at it, it's quite a lot, I would estimate. It's like 20, 30, 40 tankers just on this side. So there you have it, why the oil price is going up, because all the transport facilities are just sitting there waiting for the situation to calm down.
And it must be said that Japan, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Rick, but then Japan is, I think, the 5th largest importer of oil in the world. So basically relying on a lot of its energy supplies, on supplies that come through the Strait of Hormuz. But then I'd like to expand it. I mean, you are the East Asia correspondent, and you have been looking at the situation in South Korea as well. South Korea, if memory serves, is, I think, the 4th largest importer of oil. What is the impact that the war in Iran is having on South Korea?
So a similar story to Japan in terms of the impact on fuels. South Korea has been lifting caps on coal power to boost energy production. It's also boosting its nuclear energy at the moment. And in terms of kind of the sentiment towards the war and that call from Donald Trump for these Asian allies to join to help open the Straits of Hormuz, we saw today in Seoul, in the capital, an anti-war demonstration against Trump and the conflict in Iran.
I think we had some images also of that. But then South Korea, exactly, and those are the images of people in Seoul that Rick, you were talking about, who are against the deployment of South Korean assets to police the Strait of Hormuz. But there is another thing, is there not, with South Korea? Because South Korea is also where the US has deployed some anti-missile defenses, particularly to counter the North Korean threat. And now there is some talk of moving those assets away to be utilized in the Iranian theater of operations. Do you know anything more on that?
Yeah, so there's been quite a lot of reports, nothing confirmed from either the US, officially from the US, or the South Korea side. But yeah, there's some really big missiles that the US has as part of its presence in South Korea, basically to deter and to protect against the nuclear threat from the north. Some of these, these missiles are really complicated. They've got sophisticated radar systems, and there's been reports that the US has been moving some of those assets from South Korea to the Middle East.
Yeah, but just to sort of expand this and sort of zoom out a little bit, do you get the sense that there is a fear that's developing in Southeast Asia and maybe East Asia that the US is now going to have to move a number of assets and its attention towards the war in Iran, leaving a number of the already existing, what should one call it, problems or situations in the region for countries to deal with themselves on their own? I'm thinking, for example, North Korea versus South Korea, the problems on the Korean Peninsula. Is there a situation here, is there a fear here that the US is distracted and will potentially not come back to try and counter the Chinese hegemony, if you like, in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fear that has existed in this part of the world since Donald Trump was re-elected. There was worries that there would be less of a commitment to this region, less of a strategy involving the Indo-Pacific, and the commitment to this region could waver. I mean, we saw that in the National Defense Strategy that was released in December by the US. There was less mention of China, some mention of the first island chain. That's the chain of islands from South Korea, Japan, where I am here in Taiwan, down to the Philippines, which kind of faces China. And, we hear some rhetoric from Donald Trump that countries in this region need to take their own defense more seriously, they need to spend more on defense. But we also still see commitment to the region in joint exercises. Weapons sales, for example, to Taiwan have continued, and by some metrics, they've even increased. So there's a sort of a mixed picture about the commitment of the US to this region. But yeah, a lot of the concerns over the last year or so will have been validated when you start seeing these big missiles that, for example, South Korea somewhat rely on for their security, for their safety. When you see them being moved away, it does obviously really raise the questions of how much dedication there is to this region from the US.
I mean, you also wonder how stretched out can a power be dealing with Iran and then also its commitments, treaty ally commitments in Asia. You were talking about this earlier, the role of China. I'd like to expand on that a little bit. What is the Chinese position here? I mean, when it comes to energy supplies, for example, China is also an importer of energy supplies, and a lot of that also comes from the Strait of Hormuz. That is one dimension. But geopolitically speaking, given that the U.S. appears to be, moving certain assets away from the region, and there is question marks over U.S. commitment to the region, what does all this mean for China? How is China looking at this?
Well, I think China's shown with the Iran war, as it has over the last kind of months and even years, that it's become really quite deft at playing its hand diplomatically. So with Iran, it's not good news. It also imports a lot of oil directly from Iran that obviously has to pass through the strait. But it's hedged its bets a lot better. It's got a big strategic reserve. It has diversified its sources for energy, so it's less exposed than countries like Japan and South Korea. It obviously has like a really interesting, close relationship with Iran. They call themselves a comprehensive strategic partnership. And out of all the ships that can get through the strait, but the only ones that we've had any reports of have been Chinese ships making it through. There's also this bizarre, situation where it looks as though Donald Trump, among all the people that it's calling to help open the Strait of Hormuz, it's also mentioned China. So it seems, China's been able to spin this rhetoric that the US is asking China's help to finish a war, to clear up a mess that it started in the Middle East, which all just really plays into Xi Jinping's really having a run at positioning himself as a strong, stable, responsible world leader that can cooperate with different countries around the world, and that China is the one that's following the rules-based order, and that China is the stable partner that you should be dealing with, in contrast to the US.
Let's have a look at some viewer comments, rather. Not many questions, though. Keep the questions coming as well, especially for Rick, while we have him on. A few comments. A user says, asking for help is the most laughable moment since they threw shoes at President Bush. There's another one that from D. Ahmed, coming via TikTok. Trump underestimated the power of Iran. Cooked. And the same user says, anyone's package stuck in the Gulf by DHL. I'm sure that is.
There are problems there. But there is a comment that Gerhard did miss that I feel it's my duty to bring up. It is from the Euro Bureau, saying that the lead story is that Gerhard Elfers is not wearing a tie. What gives? Has the world gone crazy? I mean, maybe we need to do a live stream on this. So thanks for that suggestion, Eurofiber. Rick, I know it's quite late in Taiwan. Before we let you go, I just had one question. How do you see this panning out? I mean, look into your crystal ball, because I like these crystal ball type questions. What is going to be happening in the coming weeks? Do you think that Asian countries, particularly treaty allies, might be backed into a corner in trying to do what Trump expects of them, which is to send ships to the Strait of Hormuz? Or do you think that demand will change?
I think it would be quite remarkable if we did see, complying with exactly his request or making meaningful contributions to joining a conflict situation. I mean, it's interesting that Australia pretty much said no outright. Of course, they're all able to say there's no formal request. If there's a formal request, we will have a look into it. We kind of mentioned that Japan might be able to do something around helping in the later stages of a conflict. I think in previous Gulf wars, they helped with kind of rebuilding or humanitarian, sending troops in that manner. It could be a similar thing with South Korea. They could also, send ships nearby. I think there are some South Korean and Japanese ships not far from that area to escort their boats without entering the actual Straits of Hormuz, to sort of send a signal. But yeah, I can't see them rushing to join something that isn't meaningfully going to help them in the near term, and could get them very stuck in a really big mess.
You're a brave man for taking that question on, Rick. But thanks so much for doing that and for that informed analysis. We'll let you go. Thanks so much for today. I do have a question for you, Gerhard. Why aren't you wearing a tie?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's a slightly different format that we're doing here today to what I'm doing normally. And so I thought a bit more casual than usual would be appropriate.
More casual than usual. You do look casual.
Even more casual.
Yeah, thanks for looking casual. We continue on, though. This is we're looking at your questions and comments, trying to bring them in, and of course we're talking about the third week of the war in Iran, and this is where we'd like to bring in Trump's call to NATO allies. And the reason we say NATO allies because, as you saw earlier in the live stream, he was asking allies in Asia to help, but then he's also been asking NATO allies to help. This is what he was saying to the Financial Times. He had a warning, in fact, for NATO. He said, we have a thing called NATO. We've been very sweet. We didn't have to help them with Ukraine, but now we are. But the warning is, I think it will be very bad for the future of NATO if there is a negative response. So that is there from Donald Trump. And we've already had a response to that from the German Foreign Minister, Johann Wadephul. Let's just listen into what he had to say.
I have not seen that NATO has passed any resolution in this direction or that it could assume responsibility for the Straits of Hormuz. If that were the case, NATO's committees would take action accordingly.
All right, no action has been taken as of now, but then let's get an update from our very own Terry Schultz, who's reporting from Brussels. And Terry, you've covered NATO for a number of years, and I'm losing track of the number of times we've discussed what Donald Trump has said and the threats that he's issued to NATO. But here we are again. What is the response from NATO been? Is NATO looking like it's going to oblige? Is it going to send ships to the Strait of Hormuz, as Donald Trump wants NATO to do?
Well, you're much further than NATO at this moment with those suggestions. NATO doesn't have an official response. It takes a lot to figure out if there is anything to say on NATO's behalf. And it wasn't formally a request at this point. From what I understand, President Trump has not tasked his NATO ambassador with going to the allies and asking them for help. That's something that we may see in the coming days. Tomorrow, I understand there's going to be a meeting at NATO on situational awareness in the Middle East, a special meeting called to discuss what's going on. We still don't know if there will be an official request. This isn't really something that NATO does at the drop of a hat. So, again, to get 32 countries, including the U.S., on the same page is a major, major undertaking. And as far as I know, there has not even been the beginning of a conversation like that at this point.
I'm just wondering if something is posted on Truth Social, maybe that is the beginning of a conversation. But that aside, what generally is the view in NATO to what is happening in Iran?
Well, we can't really talk about a view in NATO at this point because, as I said, they have not gotten together officially since this demand was made by President Trump over the weekend. What we can talk about is how individual countries are responding. And I'm in a good place for that at the foreign ministers meeting here in Brussels. And many countries were asked, what would you do? Are you willing to send military assets to fulfill President Trump's demand? And there is not really an overwhelming sense that people want to do that at this point. Now, the European Union does have a defensive mission, a defensive operation in the area, primarily focused on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This is called Operation Aspidus, and it was set up a couple of years ago primarily to defend against piracy and against attacks on shipping there. Now, there is discussion today among the foreign ministers about possibly beefing up that mission because it does extend to the Strait of Hormuz geographically, but there hasn't really been a lot of focus on that. So EU foreign ministers will be discussing whether any of them have more assets to add to the 4 ships that currently make up that mission. And, if there is a greater presence under this EU auspices, perhaps that will add to security. But nobody wants to send their military assets, their people, into the situation while there is still an active war going on. So many of the foreign ministers arriving here today told us that they want to see what the U.S. has planned before they can make their own plans on whether to, again, send more resources there.
I know Gerhard wants to come in with some comments from our community, Terry, but just to clarify, we are talking about a potential expansion of an EU mission and not so much a NATO mission, just for the clarity for our viewers. Right. Okay, Gerhard, please.
So we have one question
That's right.
here.
There is not a NATO mission in that area.
Okay.
One comment here from a viewer coming in via YouTube that is user Battle King 8584. And he said, we should not be part of this at all. This is not our war and we should keep it that way. That's not technically a question, but I want to make it a question. Do you get the impression there with your ear close to NATO and the EU there in Brussels that is a sentiment that is widespread?
Well, it all depends on who we is. On the EU side, of course, the U.S. is not a part of the European Union. It changes a lot when you drive across town and go to NATO, where the U.S. is, of course, a member of the alliance, and where it would become a NATO issue automatically is if one of the NATO allies were attacked. And, of course, you've had something like 4 missiles shot at Turkey, which NATO's air defenses have repelled at the moment. But if Turkey were to be directly attacked, it could then call Article 4, which requires consultations about its territorial integrity, or it could, I guess, even escalate to Article 5, which, of course, has only been invoked once when the United States was attacked on 9/11. So there could be moments at which NATO doesn't have a choice as a whole to remain apart from the conflict, but we're definitely not there yet. And again, just reminding everyone that 23 EU members are also part of the 32 ally NATO. So they've got the same resources to deal with. So if on this side of town they're talking about how can we beef up this EU operation, would we have more ships to send, for example, those are the same arsenals that would have to be used if NATO were to launch an operation. So again, every country has to be very aware of what they've got, and it doesn't seem like they've got a lot to spare at the moment, even though that is what they're going to be discussing here at this EU foreign ministers meeting today.
Terry, I have another viewer question from a user with the name The Truth Matters the Last. And he or she says, can guarantee you U.S. commitment on NATO will be gone if Germany didn't give right response to the Hormuz call. What about if we're looking at the Truth Social post that we've seen earlier in the program, is NATO taking that seriously, that there could be withdrawal of the U.S. from NATO? Is it if it isn't being helped by NATO partners in Iran?
Well, this, of course, is something that NATO has faced since President Trump was reelected. Of course, always the threat that perhaps he will withdraw the U.S. If NATO allies don't respond as he likes to demands like this. But just a technical issue. President Trump himself cannot withdraw the U.S. from NATO. That would require congressional approval, and Congress made sure that he couldn't do this. So that is not going to be a knee-jerk response by the United States. He can, and he has started in some piecemeal fashion to shift U.S. resources, and he could do a lot more of that than we've seen. He could take a lot of troops out of Europe if he wanted to, and many people say, he wouldn't even have to pull the U.S. out. He could just withdraw most of the support, the actual technical support that the U.S. provides for NATO and is absolutely essential for the alliance. But I don't think that he is threatening exactly that at the moment. And remember, as you said, we discussed this so many times, he threatens NATO allies frequently with all kinds of behavior if they don't do what he wants. And, the tariff wars get mixed up into his wishes for NATO. He threatened Spain when Spain didn't let him use the 2 dual operated bases on Spanish territory for operations on Iran. So we don't know yet how he will respond if he doesn't get the backup that he wants from NATO. But let's just remind everyone that at this point, it doesn't seem like there's been an official request for backup from NATO. And after that, we launch a whole bunch of discussions about what that would even mean.
What would Brussels be without discussions, right, Terry? And what would we be without you talking about NATO? You were talking about individual countries and their capabilities. I do want to talk to you about France a bit, because just in recent days, there was this report that France is deploying 12 ships to the Mediterranean, also to the Red Sea. You had Emmanuel Macron on an aircraft carrier. Is France also thinking of deploying to the Strait of Hormuz? And I pay particular attention to France because France in recent years has become almost a leading voice for European strategy, European autonomy and European defense. So the question is France thinking of maybe expanding to the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, President Macron would be very happy to hear you say that. That's certainly the image that he wants to project. And he does, he does put some resources behind it. So we have to be very careful when we talk about this, about what deploy means. So no country at this point is saying that it wants to join or certainly initiate any offensive actions in this conflict that the U.S. and Israel have with Iran. But the allies, the European countries, have had to do some minor deployments to protect their own assets. The French bases in the UAE, the British bases on Cyprus, all of those have now come under threat because of what's happening. And so many countries, not just France, may have to send more assets to the area because they do have a presence there that they do not want to be attacked. And it becomes a fine line sometimes. What is self-defense and what becomes offensive? If you shoot down a drone that's going for one of your ships, that you didn't start it, but, it could be considered, an offensive action. So we can't discuss things in such blunt ways as President Trump does, or, if you oversimplify too much, you simply aren't telling the truth anymore. So we've got to be very careful when we discuss these things.
It's interesting, this question between what is offensive and defensive, and I bring that up because, for example, the United Kingdom, which is also a member of NATO, initially wasn't allowing the United States to use its airbases, but then it was allowing them for defensive operations. Speaking about that, and Keir Starmer has been addressing the press in the past hour. We have a soundbite from what he has been saying, but then we just have a quote that my producer is telling me, is this a quote that we're bringing up onto the screen, or is it something that he's just said? So Keir Starmer has apparently, I'm just being told by the producer, said that there will be no NATO involvement in the Strait of Hormuz. That sounds pretty conclusive. Are you surprised that that has come before an official NATO meeting, Terry?
Interesting. That's a good point. They have not met officially on this topic. So I do find it interesting that Starmer would come out and say that so forcefully. Then again, remember that any single NATO country can block action at NATO, just like they can at most operations of the EU. So if the UK says we're not getting involved, absolutely not, then there won't be a NATO operation. But with Starmer very much trying to bridge his relationship with President Trump, I am surprised that he would say that. The two men had a call yesterday. It's been reported. So, I do find that surprising.
Well, our viewers seem to be split whether NATO should or shouldn't be involved. Just read a few comments here. There's Flailing Surfer Dude. He says, Trump's now begging NATO after he was about to attack it in Greenland, which is a fair point. Big Boss 93 says, NATO doesn't have an army. NATO is nothing without us. And I assume, or that could also mean without US. And a user called Advocate Emma says, why are we begging NATO? We have the greatest military, literally no help needed.
Well, that's what Donald Trump was saying, but then apparently help is being sought after. There is one other aspect I wanted to bring in and ask you, Terry. Now, sanctions that were imposed on Russia by the United States in the wake of the war in Ukraine, this is with regards to export of oil, they have been lifted at least to allow certain countries to import oil from Russia, for example, countries like India. The Europeans aren't very happy about that. Is there already a fear amongst Europeans, and I don't know if it's amongst NATO members particularly, that the sanctions against Russia are being loosened, therefore Russia is gaining as a result of the war in Iran, thanks to the United States?
Well, let's be very specific. The sanctions were lifted temporarily by the United States, they have not been lifted by the European Union on the purchase of Russian oil. And that's a point on which I would not expect any deviation on the European side. But what President Trump decided was to let some of the oil that's been stranded at sea be sold in an effort to try to, ameliorate rising fuel prices. This is something that didn't go down well in Brussels. The European Union feels that it's very necessary to keep the strongest sanctions, to even increase sanctions on Russia, because, of course, for Europe, the existential threat is the war Russia has waged on Ukraine. They don't think that there's any reason, not even rising fuel prices, to alleviate this pressure on Russia. They want more of it. And so, yeah, that didn't go down well here. And it's unclear how long this supposedly temporary lift on those sanctions by the United States is going to last. But, the EU would very much like to see the U.S. clamp back down on Russian oil sales.
And while we have you here, Terry, Gerhard has a presentation, I think, on the oil prices, because you were mentioning it as well. You can have a look at world oil prices.
I think it's important to sort of get an overview of what's happened in recent weeks. I mean, if we're looking here, that's the oil price being at around $70 per barrel for a long time. And then here is where it all starts. The oil price rises and rises and rises up to nearly 120 on the 9th of March, roughly a week ago. And then it dropped sharply. And that happened when Donald Trump said the war is nearly over and Iran was decapitated. That sort of calmed markets a bit. Also, roughly on the same day, the G7 countries decided to tap their strategic oil reserves, so the supply side would be better equipped, if you will. But that only lasted for a day or two, and then the oil price came back up, and we're now today currently at $103 roughly per barrel. And just to remind viewers, coming from around $70 a barrel. So that's what's happened to the oil price, especially through the blockade of the Strait, the de facto blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Hegseth was saying that the Strait of Hormuz is not blocked, aside from the fact that the Iranians are shooting missiles at ships. And that's the only thing that is a slight problem there. Otherwise, he had said that the strait is open. Terry, how concerned are Europeans that these oil prices that have gone above $100 a barrel will have an impact on Europeans?
Well, it definitely is having an impact on those of us who live here. I fill up my tank to drive my kids around, and I really noticed it over the weekend. Like, the price had shot up at my local gas supplier. So I think everybody's feeling it. The price of everything is going up because of this. At the same time, I just have to go back to the European resolve not to alleviate sanctions on Russia. I mean, they really feel that they could bear high fuel prices more than they can bear Russia winning in Ukraine. And, every dollar every euro that goes into the Kremlin's pocket can be used to fuel this war effort. So they very much feel that they've got to stand firm on this. I mean, who knows? I guess I can't say that they would never consider it if the price just goes astronomically up and populations are calling for this. But at the moment, they, in fact, would rather double down on sanctions on Russia and get that war to end, especially as attention and resources and concern is now split between Russia and the Middle East.
With Donald Trump in the White House, I think it's safe to say never say never. Terry, thanks so much for being there in Brussels, and look forward to chatting with you next time about Donald Trump and NATO. I'm guessing that's going to be sooner rather than later. Bye, Terry. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Terry.
I think it's just worth reminding people that it is, in fact, the third week of attacks by the U.S. and Israel on Iran, and also Iranian retaliation in the region. It's not clear exactly how many lives have been lost, but the U.S.-based human rights activist news agency says at least 1,800 in Iran alone. Then there are also the deaths of at least 13 U.S. servicemen and women, more than 850 people in Lebanon, civilians in Israel and across the Gulf. The death toll looks set to increase with no immediate end in sight to the war. But we have, in the middle of all of that, some voices of civilians in Tehran, and this is what they have been telling news agencies. It's just worth listening to it.
This is not a good situation. But both sides seem to be testing each other, one being the West and the other Iran. But I hope they come to a conclusion fast, because people are a bit under pressure. The businesses have been closed for a month or two, and no one earns an income.
Their intention is to change our system, and I consider such a thing unlikely. This depends on the people, whether they want it or not. If the people want this, there is no need for war. They can easily hold a referendum and determine whether they want it or do not want it.
We want the war to end, but not in a way that it starts again 6 months later. We need to create a settlement so the same situation doesn't repeat.
They hit us, we hit them. Ultimately, this is war. We have seen through the 8-year Holy Defense War and the imposed 12-day war. This war will also eventually end. Iran is the victor. Iran is always the victor.
All right, a breadth of views coming there from the streets of Tehran. And just to highlight that it's very hard to connect with people in Iran. There is an internet blackout, and therefore these sound bites, we felt it was important that you all hear them because they have become available. Again, very hard to hear from people within Iran at the moment. But a quick recap now of just some of the most important developments in the US and Israeli war against Iran. And there they are. Donald Trump has urged allies to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which Iranian attacks have effectively closed. He's warned NATO that it faces what he calls a very bad future if allies fail to do so. Around 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas passes through the strait. Israel is saying it has sent troops into Lebanon for what it calls a limited and targeted operation to protect border communities from Hezbollah attacks. Now, this coming after extensive airstrikes across Lebanon. More than 800,000 people have been displaced over the past weeks in that country. And one of the world's busiest air travel hubs, Dubai International Airport, has reopened after a drone strike forced it to suspend flight operations. The war has disrupted flight operations throughout the region. And that is it for this live stream. Thanks to all of you who joined us on TikTok and YouTube, and also those who are watching this on TV.
Yes, and we will most likely be back tomorrow right here, and I'll be wearing a tie.
You will be wearing a tie tomorrow?
Yes.
That is something to look forward to, and whatever we discuss tomorrow. Thanks for sharing your comments, because those comments inform us when we are determining what to cover in our live stream. But that's it for today. Remember to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and X for all the latest news and information. You can also go to dw.com. But thanks so much
and
for being here.
Subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button right now.
I always forget to say that part, but please subscribe and hit the like button. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. See you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.